Today's program, our speaker is Dr. Jan Traphagan. He's a social anthropologist and professor of religious studies at the University of Texas at Austin. He also holds a visiting professorship at Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan. His research focuses on the relationship between science and culture and falls into two streams: life in rural Japan and the culture and ethics of space exploration. He has published numerous scientific papers and several books, including Science, Culture, and the Search for Life on Other Worlds. Professor Traphagan holds a BA in Political Science from the University of Massachusetts and Master's in Ethics from Yale University and a PhD in Social Anthropology from the University of Pittsburgh. He did postdoctoral research as a National Institute of Aging Fellow at the University of Michigan and has been a Fulbright Scholar to Japan. He is also a full member of the Scientific Honor Society, Sigma Xi. And present Professor Jan Traphagan, excuse me.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for inviting me here. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk with you a little bit about some of my research and some ideas. I'm going to share the screen here so that you have a PowerPoint presentation that goes along with this. Hope you can all see it. I'm just going to make this large enough so I can see many of you. So as Fred said, I'm going to talk about some of the questions of risk and ethics in the attempt to contact extraterrestrial intelligence. And it was interesting watching in the background, people are raising questions about whether or not we should play the Twilight Zone theme. This is an interesting area of study right now because it's moving from the world of science fiction to the world of science fact. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. And this is a very strange question. Would you baptize ET? You know, if some alien showed up, would you baptize them? And this was seriously raised at a symposium I attended at the Library of Congress that was organized by the now retired director of the history program at NASA. He was doing a visiting thing at Library of Congress. And this was a Jesuit brother who's also an astronomer, and he was the head of the Vatican Observatory Foundation at the time. And he raised this question, and I was kind of intrigued by this. He's co-authored a book that kind of explores the same question. And Pope Francis was asked about this and responded that he would if ET asked for it. This raises a series of very interesting ethical questions. It's sort of a weird question, but if you think about it, as far as I know, Catholics don't baptize dogs and cats and snakes. They only baptize humans, as far as I know. So why would you baptize ET? And the question itself challenges the idea that humans are unique. And in some ways, it undermines the very notion of particularly Abrahamic religions, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, that we've been created in the image of some particular God. Because if you're going to baptize ET, then you're basically saying, well, there are other creatures out there that are in some way like us and that are deserving of that particular response. So this has been a problem for Abrahamic religions. It's not much of a problem really with religions like Buddhism, which is I've done a lot of time studying, because Buddhism doesn't really posit any kind of specialness to humans as opposed to other animals. But one of the things that Consul Mongo, I can never say his name right, and Mueller use in the book that they did on this is that they used it to explore the history of baptizing and converting alien humans. If you think about it, you know, Christianity in particular has kind of gone around the world encountering what they saw as aliens and then trying to fix them. And really looking at through the question of imperialism and colonization, because this is in essence what's going on when we talk about missionary work. It's an attempt to impose a particular worldview on other people. That behavior, of course, raises a whole host of moral questions and consequences about what's involved with the consequences of an alien other, however we define that. So outside of my work related to this stuff, I study Japan. And of course, Japan was seen as an alien other for a long time. It still is by many people who don't, have experience with the place. And so constructing others in that way raises some really interesting moral questions. So I'm going to talk about this stuff today. What we do know is our own history shows that really thinking about these moral questions hasn't been a major impact on what people do. And in fact, in a lot of cases, not much thought has really gone on in relation to these kinds of questions. Humans tend to just go and do what they want to do often and not worry too much about that. And of course, I think that's a mistake. And I think we're doing a little better with that now than we used to. So there is a kind of fundamental question. I think this gets into this sort of idea about, is this science fiction or science fact? Well, does it really matter? I mean, come on, it's ET, it's, green aliens and stuff like that. Well, turns out astrobiology is one of the fastest growing areas of space research right now. You can major in astrobiology and a PhD. And this is a rapidly growing field because for the first time in our history, the instruments, the technical ability to actually detect life elsewhere exists. We can do this now, and we haven't done it yet, but it may happen. There are some astrobiologists and some SETI astronomers, SETI is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, who believe that we're likely to encounter some form of alien life within the next 20 years. So it's on the horizon if they're right. Some people think we've already done it. Back in the 1990s, a NASA scientist named David McKay argued that the little sort of long blob in the picture there to the right was a fossilized Martian microbe. It comes from a meteorite that had been found in Antarctica that originated on Mars. This was a big enough deal that President Clinton announced this publicly. The argument itself was ultimately unconvincing, and there has been debate about this ever since. But as recently as 2009, McKay and a group of scientists announced further findings that support the idea that they think this is some sort of fossilized form of life from Mars. So it's possible we've already found it, although it doesn't seem to be very clear right now. The James Webb Telescope that's now headed towards its Lagrange point, about 1 million miles from Earth, is going to dramatically increase our ability to detect evidence of alien life around other worlds. It won't detect life directly, but it may detect things that, such as organic compounds that might help us to understand whether or not there is life elsewhere. So the technology just keeps getting better. And we're at a point where we're probably, if there's something out there, we're going to run across it. I want to begin with just a little bit of background on the search for extraterrestrial life. And the kind of interesting thing about this is that humans have been thinking about this for a long time. This is not a new idea. The Greeks wrote about this, the Romans did, Thomas Paine wrote about it. But in the later part of the 19th century, we had developed sufficient scientific and technological tools that were needed to actually engage in some kind of search. And two things were really central to this. The first thing was the recognition that the universe is governed by physical and biological laws. The ideas of Newton and the ideas of Darwin created sort of an environment that opened up the possibility of thinking about life on other planets, because if there are universal laws that govern physics and govern biology, well, if life emerged here, it might just as well have emerged elsewhere. It became highly imaginable that there were other places, even places as near as Mars, that might have life. And of course, the telescope became increasingly technically developed, and this allowed for some things like, at the time, reasonably good images of nearby places like Mars. So they're not very good images by our standards, but at the time they were pretty good. So in the late 19th century, a very interesting thing developed. In 1877, an Italian astronomer named Giovanni Schiaparelli aimed his telescope at Mars, and he saw a bunch of straight lines. Now, these were not really there. They were the result of problems with the optics, but he dubbed them canali in Italian, which means channels, and was an unfortunate choice because it got translated into English as meaning canals. And canals are different from channels because they imply construction. And this got people into thinking, including scientists, that maybe these were actually canals. One thing that did seem to be the case was that Mars was a world with running water, oceans, and these channels. That's what Schiaparelli thought. That's what a lot of other scientists thought. Of course, they had no way at that time to really recognize that that was not the case. And a businessman and astronomer named Percival Lowell was so convinced that this was the case and that these lines represented channels that he believed that Mars had an alien civilization that was actually technologically far beyond our own abilities. So this is interesting. It's more than a century ago. People are having a debate about whether or not there's an intelligent life and civilization on Mars right next door. By the late 19th and early 20th century, most scientists had concluded that intelligent life seemed pretty unlikely on Mars. But the discourse continued, of course, in science fiction, has for a long time. By the 1950s, the general population had become quite fascinated by the idea that there might be aliens out there, or that humans might find their way into space and meet up with other people. You get movies like Forbidden Planet in the 1950s that depict humans going out into space and encountering an advanced civilization that has died off. But for the most part, this was not an area of serious scientific investigation from the perspective of most of the academic world. The search for extraterrestrial life wasn't taken seriously. It was relegated to science fiction. And even today, where I think it's become much more accepted, at times it gets what I call the giggle response, where you tell someone I'm doing stuff related to the search for extraterrestrial life, and people kind of smile and chuckle and go, oh, well, that's cute. But it actually has become a serious part of the academic world. And the beginnings of this are back in the end of the 1950s, when a guy named Philip Morrison and another one named Giuseppe Ciccone, who were both at Cornell, they were astronomers, published a paper in Nature in which they raised the idea of searching the microwave spectrum for signals for extraterrestrial life. This was a novel idea. It was based on the notion that there might be other civilizations out there, like ours, that are sending out signals, whether they're intentional or not. They both knew Mars didn't have intelligent life, but even at that late date, in their article, they raised the possibility that there might have been vegetation on Mars, which doesn't seem to be the case, as evidence that there might be life elsewhere. This idea took root. A guy named Frank Drake, the guy in the middle picture there on the right, in 1960 was so intrigued by this that he mounted the first SETI experiment, which he called Project Ozma. This used time at the Naval Astronomical Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia, and he pointed it at two stars that were about 10 light years from Earth, and used about 150 hours of time to observe whether or not there were any signals. He actually initially thought that he had gotten a signal. He was very excited apparently about it, but it turned out to be some sort of secret army thing going on at a base nearby, and it wasn't from ET, and they got no evidence of it. But this intrigued some other astronomers, and in 1961, Drake held a conference at Green Bank with Morrison and a guy named Carl Sagan to discuss how they might develop a science of looking for the possibility of life on worlds. I will tell you that there has been very little progress. There is to date no evidence that we have encountered anything anywhere from anywhere else. There have been a couple tantalizing things that have cropped up back in the 1970s. There was something called the WOW signal, which was picked up by the Big Ear radio telescope at Ohio State University. It was a 72-second non-terrestrial extrasolar signal. And you can see the picture there. The spot is circled, and the scientist who found it wrote WOW next to it, which is why it's called that. And what the numbers indicate is that this was much louder than normal background radiation. And interestingly, it was at 1420 megahertz, which is actually the frequency that hydrogen resonates. And Some scientists have argued that if you were going to send out a signal, this would be a good wavelength to send it at, or a good frequency to send it at, because it sends information about your knowledge of the universe, that you know that hydrogen is the most abundant element, without actually having to say anything. If you just pick that particular frequency, it's going to suggest that you know something about the universe. So the problem, of course, if you send messages, is how does anybody else understand what you're saying? The source seems to have been somewhere in the Sagittarius constellation. There have been a lot of discussions about it since. The person who found it has argued that it probably was bouncing off of something that we put up in space, but we really don't know. The signal's never been encountered again, so we can't really do much with it. There have been a few other things like, wow, in fact, most recently, there was a signal that was picked up that appeared to be coming from Alpha Centauri. And that got people really interested for a while. And it was just, again, something that was produced by our own satellites that looked like it was coming. So basically, in now well over, we're over 60 years or so of SETI research, what we actually have is deafening silence. We found absolutely no evidence that there's anybody else out there. And so that's a problem. It raises a question of why are we wasting our time on this? And we might as well just give up because we're not getting anywhere. But the problem is that the distances that we're talking about, and this is often something that people don't seem to recognize when they watch, Star Trek or things like that, and everyone just bopping around the galaxy. The distances are just astounding. If we've been listening for 60 years, if the signal is, and the only signals that we could detect would be those that would be the sort of thing that travel at the speed of light, that means that anything we might detect has to have come from within 60 light years of our planet. Well, our galaxy is 100,000 light years across. We've barely gotten things out of our kind of immediate area. And if it comes from much further, things could come from much further, but they would be much older civilizations. And I'll come back to that and talk about it in a few minutes. So as for what we've been broadcasting, we've been sending television, radar, and things like that since the 1930s. So about 80 years. So again, if someone's heard our broadcasts, and you might find it rather interesting that the very first broadcasts that aliens will pick up, this showed up in the movie Contact, will be from Nazi Germany. That's actually they were the initial television broadcasts. Not that they would understand anything about what that meant, but let's say somebody's picking up one of those broadcasts right now, and they decide they want to say hello back to us. Well, it's going to take another 80 years for their response to get to us. So we're dealing with something that probably is going to take hundreds of years as far as intelligence goes. Other kinds of life maybe much sooner, but we could run across something tomorrow, but we're not going to have a conversation with these people if there's somebody else somewhere out there where we say hi and they respond. We're going to have long intervals in between any kind of communication. That's something that has to be kept in kind of perspective on this. There have been a lot of recent advances that suggest that maybe we'll at least know that there's life out there somewhere. We know about exoplanets. The first one was confirmed in 1992. We know that around some stars there are habitable planets, or at least what we think might be, and they're not that far away. So for example, TRAPPIST-1 is about 40 light years away, and it may have as many as 7 planets that we would consider potentially habitable. There are about 4,000 confirmed exoplanets as of now, and at least 100 of those look like they could be habitable by beings like us, at least it's possible. And there are estimates of anywhere between 800 billion and 3.5 trillion planets in our own galaxy, including as many as 100 billion Terran type planets. So there's lots of possibility out there. But again, the distances are just incredible. Also in our own solar system, Europa appears to have a liquid ocean of salt water with an Earth-like chemical balance. There could be life there. Mars is not ruled out yet for life. There could be life under the surface. There's probably not anything on the surface. Titan orbiting Saturn is, a moon with an atmosphere that looks a lot like Earth's was when life emerged, possible there. So even in our immediate neighborhood, there's the possibility. So it seems like there's a good chance that life is all over the place. I think if we actually find evidence of life in our own solar system, it would suggest that the galaxy, at least our galaxy, is teeming with life, and maybe there's a lot of intelligent life. I don't know. But there's always the possibility that Earth is the only place life has emerged. I think it's unlikely. So there's this kind of sense that given the speed of technological innovation, there's a good shot that we might run across something sooner. It may not be intelligent, but we certainly may run across life. And of course, it's also possible that if there are other civilizations out there, they're looking for life as well. So maybe we'll bump into each other because we're both looking. What this means is we're kind of at a precipice. For one thing, we're actually entering the space age that I suspect many of everyone here thought we were going to be entering in the 1960s that kind of never really materialized. But we are definitely going to space. We are going to colonize Mars. That's going to happen. And this is the time we should be thinking about the consequences of encountering life in other places, not after we bump into it. So it's a good time to be asking these questions. So what kinds of ethical questions arise in relation to this? Well, I want to begin with some assumptions that exist in relation to SETI, and there are some very unreasonable assumptions that have guided SETI really since its beginning in the 1960s. One is that aliens will think in uniform ways and have a uniform culture. This is widely the case when you hear SETI scientists talking about what they think alien civilizations might be like. They tend to treat them as a monolith, as though you don't have any dissent or disagreement or anything among the people, that they all more or less have somehow found consensus around things. As a result, they'll be consistent and predictable, and they'll display some sort of cultural consensus. And all you have to do is think about our own planet and say, well, if they're anything like us, that's definitely not going to be the case. It seems to be a really problematic way of thinking about how other people might be on another world. So there's this kind of a tacit assumption that an alien civilization will be socially unified, which means it'll be very unlike our own world. That's a problem. There's also an assumption that has often been talked about by astronomers like Frank Drake. Jill Tarter, who is the head of the research division of the SETI Institute for quite a long time, also has written things along these lines that ET is going to be altruistic because they're significantly more technologically advanced than we are. And there's a tendency to sort of equate technological advancement with social and moral advancement. I don't think we see any real evidence of that on our own planet. I think it would be difficult to make a case that modern humans, while being dramatically more technologically advanced than the Romans, have come very far from a moral perspective or a social perspective. We're different, but I don't know that you could argue easily that we're more advanced or better. And there's also a sense that at some level we'll be able to empathize with this alien intelligence. This is a fundamental problem because if you think about intelligent life evolving on another planet, they're going to be in a different environment. And it is quite possible that we won't even be able to say hello to ET because they simply will process information in a different way from the way we do. Imagine a world in which bats were the things that, or bat-like creatures became the dominant intelligent species. Well, they echolocate. They're very different from us. And it's reasonable to question whether or not we'd be able to communicate. So all of these assumptions there's a pretty good chance they're wrong. And they've been powerful in guiding SETI research. Unfortunate. There are some more reasonable assumptions. One is that any civilization with which we make contact is likely to be much older than ours. Now, you might ask yourself, why is that the case? Well, the odds of if the galaxy isn't teeming with civilization, the odds of making contact are actually relatively low. And so the longer transmission has been going on, the better the chance that we're going to make contact. So if a civilization has been transmitting for 500 years, well, we might have a shot at bumping into that, unless, of course, if they're aiming at us directly, then there's a better chance. But this has some also interesting kind of problems. One problem is let's say someone sent us directly a message. They knew we were here and they sent a message to us 500 years ago. Well, that means that if we're getting it today, they're 500 years beyond us technologically, because they're using some sort of technology that we can pick up on right now. So let's say they had radio telescopes 500 years ago. Well, we see the rate of technological change in our own world right now. It's hard to imagine what 500 years is going to bring. So even a relatively short time span like that could mean just being vastly more advanced than we are. Steve Dick, who again is a NASA historian I was talking about a few minutes ago, has raised the idea that we're in the middle of creating artificial intelligence. We don't know where that's going to go, but he thinks it's quite possible that a significantly advanced civilization will be post-biological, and that whatever's out there that we might communicate with is part of a post-biological universe. We may not be particularly interesting or even important to such I don't know what you call them, beings or what you call it, but artificial intelligence may wind up replacing us, and we may generate a post-biological world. So there's some really interesting questions about where all this is going, and it leads to a couple of broad ethical issues. One issue is, should we engage in trying to contact intelligent aliens if they're out there? What kinds of risks and benefits are associated with contact? The other is related to the question of protecting life. What obligations do we have to protect life on other worlds, whether intelligent or not? And if there are microbes on Mars, do we have some obligation to it? And Mars and Europa, it's possible there's even something more going on than microbes, but let's just say that all we've got is microbes. This is an immediate problem because Elon Musk is planning to colonize Mars, and he's building the infrastructure and the equipment necessary to do it. That's going to happen sooner, not later. So if we show up on Mars, we start stomping around, our arrival might put any life that does exist there at risk. So there's a question of whether or not organisms, things like microbes, do they have a right to their own evolutionary trajectory? This has been raised by scientists and social scientists in the astrobiology community, and gets talked about to some extent, although I will say it's not a really major issue, although it is something that is discussed at NASA when thinking about things like sterilizing to the extent possible anything that we send to Mars so that we don't bring our own microbes and possibly screw up something that's there. But the fact of the matter is, I think most of us would agree that humans are not exactly great when it comes to taking care of ecosystems. So I think we should be thinking about this pretty seriously. There's also the possibility that the encounter with life on other worlds poses some risks for humans. We might have come across some sort of virus or pathogen that might lead to the annihilation of humanity. This has been addressed in things like microcritons, the Andromeda strain, but in fact, NASA was concerned about this with the Apollo missions, which is why, in fact, the astronauts that came back, for example, on Apollo 11 were quarantined for a period of time after they got back to Earth, just in case there were some kind of pathogens on the moon. So, these things have been thought about, and there are certainly risks. If there's something on Mars that might pose a risk to humans, we could do ourselves a lot of trouble by just showing up there and somehow bringing it back to Earth. The big debate recently has actually focused more on what we should be doing in terms of trying to contact possible intelligent aliens. So there is, again, discussion about this issue of microbial life, and that's ongoing. But there's been kind of an out-and-out shouting match in the academic world related to this stuff when it comes to intelligence. And this is related to two broad categories of SETI research, which are known as passive SETI or active SETI. Passive SETI is just listening, seeing what might come our way, and then deciding what's going on if we intercept something. Active SETI, or sometimes called METI, which is Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence, involves sending out signals with the aim of trying to make contact. As I will talk about in a few minutes, this is not science fiction. It's already been done. We've sent signals out, and quite a few of them. And so there's some serious problems with this from an ethical perspective. So again, passive SETI involves listening for signals. This seems very tame, right? You just listen, what's there to worry about? Well, there are some things to worry about. Some scholars have raised the issue that messages directed to us might encode viruses intended to take down our computer systems. Now, if you work from the idea that ET is advanced and therefore altruistic, you would assume they wouldn't do that. But ET may not be altruistic. ET might be really nasty. And maybe they even just get a kick out of watching civilizations collapse. We don't know anything about what another civilization might be like. But the fact of the matter is, they could be dangerous. And even receiving a message could present problems for us, assuming that there was any way in which their computer technology could sort of, interact with our computer technology and create a problem. So it might be far-fetched, but it's not completely impossible. The other thing that's been raised quite a bit is whether or not the knowledge of the existence of ET could change humanity in unpredictable ways. There are people who've talked about the possibility of panic. I actually don't think this is very likely. And the reason I don't think it's likely is because we've already thought we encountered ET. Back in the late 19th century, Percival Lowell was writing about how there was a civilization right next door on Mars, and people were believing that. It was in magazines, it was in the, then form of the public media, and there was a broad discourse on it, and it didn't cause panics. So I don't think that's actually too likely, but we also don't know what might occur. When we look at religions like Christianity or Islam that focus on this idea that humans are in some way special, well, what happens when we're not special? We're not alone anymore. And I think that's a question of some interesting possibilities of what might occur, and I have no idea where that might go. Active SETI has been the locus of kind of the biggest debate related to this. And the simple question is, should we be sending messages out into the galaxy in hopes of making contact? An astronomer named Seth Shostak, a psychologist named Doug Vakoch, and an engineer named Bill Kitchen are very much in favor of this. Astrophysicist Stephen Hawking, a philosopher at Clemson named Kelly Smith, and me don't think it's a very good idea. So I'm going to talk a bit about both sides of this and give you a sense of what the arguments have been. The guy at the top there is Doug Vakoch. He's a really cool guy. I like him a lot. I totally disagree with him on this. He has founded an organization called METI International, which is set up with the idea of sending messages. He's argued that the galaxy is so big that if we don't seek out contact, there's a really low chance we'll make contact in the near future. Now, whenever he makes this case, I ask him, why do we have to make contact in the near future? What difference does it make? And he's got some answers to that. And I think one answer to that is that he'd really like to be alive when that happens. Well, I would too. But I'm not sure that's worth putting us at risk. He also thinks that the possible benefits outweigh the risks that might come along. So one is he thinks there's a low possibility that ET is going to be nasty, and that has to do with the fact that they're more advanced. Maybe they can even help us. Maybe they can help us get through the mess that we've made of our planet and our problems with our politics and all the other things. So he also makes another important point. If ET can get to our planet, we're toast. If they have the technology to do something that we can imagine, but we can't possibly do right now, they also probably have the technology to pretty much do us in. So in that sense, it doesn't matter that much. They're out there. Now, other people will raise this point. Well, why call attention to us? Why send out signals saying, hi, we're here, when ET might in fact have the potential to get here and vaporize the planet or eat our brains or something like that. Seth Shostak at the bottom, he just thinks it's a moot point. He said, well, we've been broadcasting for 80 plus years. we've already let the cat out of the bag. It doesn't make any difference if we send things out that are intentional or not, because we have littered the at least immediate 80 light years of space with signals that say we're here. And so it really doesn't make a difference what we do. So there's this strong side that we should be sending things out. There are quite a few people in the SETI community, actually including Jill Tarter, who I mentioned before, who don't think we should be sending things out, who think we should only be listening. This guy here, Bill Kitchen, actually is planning to do something. He is a very wealthy entrepreneur and engineer. If you're familiar with these indoor like parachute things, I've never done this, but there's one not too far from where I live. He invented that technology apparently. So he made a lot of money off of it. And he proposes sending the Google servers and the human genome, and maybe all of Earth's genome, into space as a backup with directions on how to reconstruct it. This sounds pretty funny, but he's dead serious about it. I've been in meetings with him. He makes a very strong case that it's something we have to do. He's concerned that we're pretty likely to just do ourselves in anyway, so this would give us immortality. I don't know why humanity needs immortality, but he thinks it does, and would somehow preserve the fact that we had been here. He has every intention of doing this, and he has the money to do it. And I've been in meetings where he has stated that absolutely nothing will stop him, even when we're having heated debates over the ethics of this kind of thing. I think that there's a fair amount of hubris involved in his perspective. I think he wants to be the one that does this. But the fact is, he's probably going to do it. And that raises, risk for our planet. I'll come back to that in a minute. So the argument against, well, Stephen Hawking is actually one of the people who was strongly against this. And one of the points he makes is that intelligence is found in predatory creatures on Earth. It may, in fact, even be a prerequisite to intelligence. If that's the case, there's a pretty good chance that ET is predatory. They're not going to be nice and happy and altruistic. They will, as seems to be likely, if we even if they come here, they will have vastly superior technology to us. And we know that the history of contact on Earth between any kind of technologically unequal civilizations always goes bad for the less advanced civilization. It never goes well for the one that is weaker in terms of technology. So from his perspective, the risk is simply too great to actively seek contact. If aliens visit us, he says, the outcome would be much as when Columbus landed in America, which didn't turn out too well for the Native Americans. Kelly Smith, a philosopher at Clemson, argues there's actually no basis on which to arrive at a consensus about whether or not we should send messages that represent all of humanity, or even what to send. How do we determine what to send? In other words, who speaks for Earth? His argument is that even the slightest risk of annihilation of humanity means that we are morally obligated to refrain from sending messages. And he thinks the risk is extremely slight. He doesn't see any reason to think ET is going to come up and wipe us out. But it's not zero. And because it's not zero, he argues that no individual nor any group has the right to engage in some kind of risky activity that would put all of us in danger, and really the human species as a whole in danger, without finding some basis for agreement or consensus that the risk is worthwhile. Of course, we can't even agree in our own country about much of anything, so it seems unlikely that we're going to be able to do that on a global scale. I have a kind of different take on this. The problem that we also have is that we have no idea how contact from us might influence the other end. Imagine if they're xenophobes but they like astronomy and they come across our message. It might disrupt their society, might cause some sort of social or cultural catastrophe for them. Without any knowledge of those who might be recipients at the other end, from my perspective, we should refrain from sending messages because we just don't know what we might do. And if this seems a little bit over the top, let me give you an example. I put together a thought experiment a while back, and I was imagining an alien astronomer sitting at her desk going over her data, and I called her in Iran, and She's at a planet, different planet from Mars, and she's intercepted this kind of unexpected signal that seems to have patterns suggesting it might not be natural. So she checks with some colleagues at other radio telescopes to see if she can get confirmation. And sure enough, she's hit the jackpot. It's not a natural signal, and it's not from her planet. And in fact, it contains some information that suggests that there may be knowledge of mathematics and music associated with the signal. So this is pretty exciting stuff. Now, a little bit about her world. Rome lives on a world that I call Ninohe. It has a unified government. They don't have war, but of course they still have political conflict, because just because you stop having war doesn't mean you agree on it. They have debates about benefits and costs of active SETI or even passive SETI like we do. They don't have any religion, which is pretty cool. But they're very formal and ritualized in the way they organize their society. And they have a social structure that's caste-based. The upper caste is the educated elites who pursue philosophy and scientific inquiry. Unlike our planet, they're also the politicians. The middle caste is agriculturalists who are regarded positively because they provide food for the whole society. And then the lower caste are merchants who are regarded negatively because they engage in self-centered activities, gaining wealth for themselves. So the upper caste in the society is sort of the glue that holds the whole system together. It provides balance between the middle and the lower castes. So it's kind of the key to the whole thing. Now, they have this interesting ideology, okay, where they emphasize balance and reciprocity. Each caste has rights and responsibilities vis-a-vis the other caste. So the middle caste feeds the upper and lower castes and receive benefits like healthcare from the state and goods like clothing from the merchants. The Ninoheans believe that balance in the universe is maintained by ensuring stability through ritual, political, and economic relations among the castes. So political stability is based on balance. Upset the balance and the entire world come unglued. And you could have mass demonstrations and political violence are likely. So they're taught in school right from the start that intelligence, if it exists anywhere else, would also have to build societies this way, because this is the way intelligent beings operate. They believe in reciprocal balance, and that's the way they create a stable society. So for the Ninoheans, balance is a fundamental prerequisite to intelligence and social order. So they get this message, and it turns out it's from Earth. Well, you can imagine where this is going, right? She gets a bunch of experts in, like psychologists and anthropologists and linguists, and they start trying to make sense of the message. And the humans, being really interested in talking with somebody else, they send additional messages that contained all sorts of information. These aliens seem pretty friendly, but their world doesn't look much like Ninohe. The Earthlings took the kitchen sink approach and sent the entire Google servers. So the Ninoheans got a pretty healthy dose of what earthly life is like. And what it shows is environmental degradation caused by industry, war, poverty, wealth, unequal wealth, science, music, all kinds of different things. And it doesn't look like balance plays much of a role on Earth. In fact, if anything, it looks like these weird aliens are dominated by imbalance. Their society looks like the exact opposite of the Ninohean society. Well, what's this going to do to Ninohe? Well, widespread knowledge among less educated people that there's a world of intelligent beings, or, well, they don't seem all that intelligent, but they build big radio telescopes. And their world isn't organized around this idea of belief that destabilized Ninohe. And Earth is really weird because they're technologically advanced, but they don't seem to be concerned about balance at all. It's a direct contradiction to their entire ideology. So if their world is thrown into chaos because of the message we send, are we morally responsible for that? Now, of course, we might never know it happened, but it's quite possible that it would happen if we looked so different from them, from a social and ideological perspective. Now, you might think, all right, this is a silly idea. Well, it's actually not, because it happened. Ninohe is loosely based on Japan of the Edo period. They had a caste system that was not unlike the one that I invented for this planet. And much of their social structures were similar to what I'm talking about with this. And the arrival of American Commodore Perry completely disrupted Japanese society in the 1840s. It led to the Boshin War, which was a brief civil war. It led to the end of the shogunate. The man there is the last shogun, and a complete revision of political and social structures in Japan. It was a staggering change. In the long run, this created a competition between Japan and the US that ended very badly when Japan lost World War II and was nuked. And by the end of the war, it had 62 of their 65 major cities, 90% bombed. I kind of doubt Commodore Perry had that in mind when he showed up. Not that he was terribly concerned about the future of Japan, but I don't think he could have imagined an outcome like World War II being what ultimately was stimulated by his arrival in Tokyo Bay and his kind of standard American approach to diplomacy, in which he said, trade with us or we'll bomb you. And so there's a lot of unpredictability with this. And in fact, we can see in our own history exactly these kinds of things happening when contact happens between very different civilizations. Now, some people might say this is a moot point. METI International that I mentioned before, created by Doug Vakoch, has the goal of sending out well-developed messages. He wants to make contact. There was controversy among the SETI community when the organization was formed. There's still people who disagree with it, but they're already sending messages. There have been other messages sent all the way back to 1974 when Frank Drake sent a message from the now defunct Arecibo dish in Puerto Rico that was intended to contain some information about humans. It's very difficult to decipher, even if you look at it, you'd get a couple of things, but you wouldn't get too many things in it. So it's already been done. We've sent messages, but there still remains this broad ethical question of whether or not we should be doing this. So to conclude, one thing I would say is the science of astrobiology has really brought us to a point where the possibility of contact with some form of alien life is no longer science fiction. It's probably going to happen if it's out there. And it might happen fairly soon. There are a variety of ethical questions that we need to consider before contact is made to reduce the risk to both sides. This stuff is beginning to be explored in the academic world and in government levels to some extent, but it's still limited. As I mentioned, the Library of Congress has an endowed chair in astrobiology now, and there's a Society for Social and Conceptual Implications of Astrobiology. So there is a kind of growing interest in this in the academic world, but we're at the beginning of this. And of course, technology moves fast. So we may already be behind the 8 ball on this, I'm not sure. So with that, I want to bring my talk to a close and open this for any questions. I will stop screen sharing and just raise.
Oh, I did the wrong thing, John. I pushed the wrong button for you. Turn your camera back on. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. There we go.
Want to thank, besides that FUPA, thank you very much. I thought it very interesting. Several comments in chat. Let's go back to where we started. First off, Robert Bosca asked a question directly to me that I'm going to read to you. The UK has designated octopi, squid, and lobster as sentient creatures. Would taking a closer look at animal rights, especially of sentience, help prepare for extraterrestrial interactions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think that is one way to look at it. Of course, the sort of the issue that exists with this is that squids and octopi aren't going to talk back to us. And so there's some different questions related to, at least if we were to run across an intelligent civilization where we might have some sort of interaction that would be different. But I think this question, it could be really interesting if it turns out that, for example, Europa actually has complex organisms living in its ocean. Because then there really is, I think, a very powerful question about, first of all, what do we mean by sentience? That's always a problem with this. And then there are, of course, a lot of debates about animal rights. And of course, this gets into a question about how we define animals. Are humans animals? In the West, humans have not really been thought of as animals, at least until fairly recently. We're distinguished from animals. And in other parts of the world, other philosophies, we're not, like in Buddhism, we're not that different from other living beings. So I think it's a really good question. I don't have an answer where it would go, but one thing I would hope is that non-Abrahamic philosophical perspectives would be involved in that, because they look at the relationship between humans and other animals quite differently from the way the Abrahamic traditions do.
Okay. Michelle Vicks had an ironic comment. She really liked your comment that ET can't phone home. She thought it was kind of a laugh out loud kind of moment.
Okay.
Sherry also liked one of the comments you had where the to serve man image.
Yes,
she
that's
loved
what that's from. Yeah.
But on the other hand, with global warming, we may not be having an 80-year back and forth conversation. So I gather we're good for now, is her comment. I had a question for you, and it comes about recognizing communications. Given that we use our communication methods, how is it likely that we would recognize other methods? I know it's a wide open field, and I'm just curious about that.
It's been discussed quite a lot, and we don't know that we could do that. You know, the problem. So here's a good example of a problem with this. Let's say 500 years ago, a civilization about at the level we're at right now of development sends out a signal aimed at Earth or in this general direction, because they've found that there's, planets that are similar to theirs around our star. And so it gets here now. Well, if we send back the same kind of message, we're talking about 1,000 years between when it was sent and received. Are they still going to be using the same kind of radio technology? It's very unlikely. They will probably have, if they're still around, they might just be gone. But if they're still around, in that 1,000 years, they've probably developed technologies that are way beyond anything we can imagine right now. And they also probably don't remember our technology. They wouldn't really have much reason to. So they might not even get the return response. They might just miss it. And so this is a problem. There have been, astronomers have been looking into other things, like looking at lasers, seeing if they can find evidence of use of lasers for communication in space. And so there is I think there's a pretty widespread awareness of the problem, but the problem is we can't detect anything we can't detect. If we don't know the technology, we're just never going to find it. So there's been this kind of question about where the hell is everybody? If we had this, galaxy that should be filled with intelligence, there's nobody out there as far as we can tell right now. Well, one possibility is they are all out there, but they're using technologies we can't detect. And so again, we can't talk to each other because we can't even see that they're there given technology that we use. And that may not even mean that we're horribly backwards. It may just mean we use different technology. We're not, we're just not capable of communicating because of that. So it's a very important question. And I don't, people try to come up with the answer, well, maybe evolution will work in such a way that we'll develop similar types of things. Yeah, maybe, but maybe not. We only have one data point. Our planet's the only data point we have. So we really have no idea what might happen on other planets where intelligence arises. It could be dramatically different from us. It's a great question.
Okay, well, thank you. Sue had a question for you. In thinking that if they can get here, they would destroy us, aren't we assuming that they would act like us?
Well, they wouldn't necessarily destroy us. What I would say is they have the potential to. If they have the technology to get here, they're very, very, very far beyond us. And it doesn't necessarily mean they would destroy us. The problem is that we have really no idea what they would do. They might be like us. Hawking's idea is that, if being a predator is one of the things that leads to intelligence, then they might act a lot like us and be really nasty. On the other hand, maybe that's not the case. Maybe there are other ways intelligence emerges and they might be really, really nice and warm and fuzzy and come and help us and make us feel good and then eat us for dinner, like, to serve man. I don't know. there are so many possibilities. The one thing, though, that does seem clear, if they can get here, they are so far beyond us technologically that if they are nasty, there's nothing we can do to stop them. That's one thing that's pretty certain, because we're very far from the technology that would allow us to travel vast distances in space. I mean, it takes us forever just to get to Mars. And so, you know, if they're able to figure out how to get here from another planet around another star, they've figured out something that we don't understand yet.
Mhm. So Eugene, when you on your slide for about talking about kitchen, he thought you had an excellent typo for immortality, which on your slide was immorality.
Oh, geez. I'll have to fix that. Thank you.
Well, it's just that he thought it was great.
Must have been a Freudian slip.
Well, it could be. We all do those things at some points, don't we? Andy had a question for you. Is there any difference between targeting messaging toward ET versus the various communications currently going on as to ET's ability to receive?
Well, if we actually were to target towards a particular place where we thought that there was intelligence, they would be able to tell that we targeted in that direction, so that they would have some sense that it had been sent intentionally. Whereas things like just our transmissions from television and stuff like that, they're just kind of going out there and they're not aimed at anybody. So in that sense, the way that we go about sending a transmission will tell ET something about what it is and what we are. This is what I mentioned about sending something at 1420 megahertz, because that's the frequency that hydrogen vibrates at. That tells ET something about us, that we know something about physics and we know something about the universe without actually having to say anything. Targeting also does that. Now, part of the problem too is that, for messages to reach any significant distance, vast amounts of energy are needed for them to be strong enough to be likely to be picked up, unless ET's got much better technology than we have for that kind of thing. So there's another issue of, you get farther away, it's just harder to pick these things up. And, we're now getting to the point where our transmissions are a good 80 light years out from our planet, and they should be very weak. I think they could be picked up, but they're weak. And so if there's nobody right around us within this sort of 80 light year neighborhood, it might just be that whatever we send just won't be noticed because it won't be strong enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you were talking about the ethics of contacting or not contacting, Michelle Vicks made the comment, think Star Wars, and then laughs.
Yeah. Well, most of our science fiction is pretty funny in terms of, we're unless we figure out some way to surpass the speed of light with both communications technology and with being able to move around, we're never going to really talk to anybody. That's really what it comes down to, because the distances are simply too extreme. And so we won't have conversations. We might discover somebody else is out there, but we're not going to, if there's an 80-year lag between hello and how are you, we're just not going to have any kind of real exchange or conversation, because people might, in either place, might simply forget about the other.
Mm-hmm. So Frank Robinson had a comment about your thought experiment with, and I'll probably say this wrong, Nihoe. He thinks it resembles humanity way too much. A real alien civilization would likely be vastly more different.
Maybe not. We have no idea. This is one of the things about this, is that there's so much speculation involved. We don't know anything about evolutionary processes on other planets. We have no idea. It could be that things happen in fairly similar ways. Some people have argued that kind of humanoid type creatures are a very likely thing to occur in other places. So maybe social and cultural structures would be similar. Maybe they'll be entirely different. But even with that, even if it's something that's just dramatically different from what we imagine on Earth, we still could disrupt them. We just don't know. To me, that's actually one of the biggest problems, is that we know nothing about what else might be out there in terms of life. And so we're taking a risk for the other side, in addition to ourselves, by trying to make contact with a complete unknown thing.
Mhm. Sue asked, isn't there an ethical issue in a small group of astrobiologists and rich men making decisions that could have devastating effects for all of us?
Yeah, exactly. That's really what I'll narrow it down a little bit further. It's basically a small group of white old people who have PhDs in astronomy and who are getting bitten at the corners by a few other white old people who have PhDs in other fields, who are telling them, you can't make these decisions for everybody. But this is exactly a big part of the problem, is that these are people who are actually taking actions by sending messages that they have a very narrow, very ethnocentric view of everything, pretty much, and they're making decisions that conceivably could affect the entire population of our planet. And
Mhm.
you know, you hit it right on the mark. I mean, that's exactly what's going on. In fact, there are very few women involved in astrobiology. There are more now than there were, but there are very few. There are very few people of color involved. It is not a group of people that represents our planet in any way, shape, or form.
Mhm. Frank Robinson, after he heard you compare Nihoe to Japan, he think it actually demonstrates how human-like your hypothetical is.
Say that again?
Well, Frank Robinson, he was asked about whether or not an alien culture would be like Nihoe. He thought it was too similar to Earth-like cultures, and he wrote that before hearing Japan. But then he goes on to say that he feels it demonstrates how human-like your hypothetical is.
Yeah, and the fact that it's so human-like and it could happen among two different groups of humans suggests how intensely even more problematic it could be if they're very unlike us.
Yeah,
I
if I
mean,
can,
yeah.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
If I can interject, I think, but that's where we all come from with this, and that's where my prior question was. We only have what we know and how
Right.
to assess what's going on around us and in communication with others. And if we're talking different things, we'll talk right past each other, not even hear it.
Yeah. And so if we can't do that and we're the same species, well, what are the risks involved with something that evolved intelligence in an environment unlike ours?
Okay, I have several more questions, but Fred raised his virtual hand a while ago, so I want to take a minute to recognize Fred.
Thank you. I have sort of two comments. One is the entrepreneur engineer you mentioned who planned on using artificial intelligence and human genome to be sent into space. Reminded me of a book I read in the 90s by a physicist from Tulane named Frank Tripler. Wrote a book called The Physics of Immortality, in which he claimed that humans will never travel to other worlds because of the distance and the time involved, but we will have the capability with computers to search for hospitable planets and have human DNA or the genome information. And when they find the hospitable planet, they will colonize it, which seems to me to be very ego/ethnocentric. And as you mentioned, it can disrupt or destroy another world, introducing something foreign. And by that reasoning, it could be happening to us, or it could happen to us. You know, we never know.
Yep.
But it just represents, like, along with the small group of rich white men, a very, narrow-minded focus, totally oblivious to, consequences.
Yep.
And the other comment was that given the unlikely that there is life out there that we will contact and will be something to make use of, all the resources and science and money and technology that goes into this, messaging might be better spent directed towards problems we're currently facing.
Yep.
That's,
I agree. I'm not convinced that in many ways this is really something of tantamount importance that we should be investing in. I think it would be cool if we ran across ET and were able to learn something from them and have a nice interaction. But we have a lot more pressing problems. But there are, people like, there's a Russian, what's his name, Yuri Milner. He's investing millions in this. There's a whole group that he's developed called, I forgot the name of it, but anyway, they're centered at Cal Berkeley and some other places. And, there are people who they want to be the ones who discover life elsewhere. And I can understand that. I think it would be cool, but I don't know, those millions probably could be invested in something else that might be more good.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Carol had a question for you, that if we find signs of life in our solar system, how can we know it is not the result of contamination by private exploration?
Well, we can't know for sure, although there are a couple of things that would suggest that it's unlikely. For example, if we find that, let's say that, few inches or more under the surface of Mars, there's evidence of, significant microbial life, it's unlikely that anything we sent there could have generated that in such a short time. So it seems, likely that it's something that emerged. Now, there are some interesting other problems related to that because, Mars and Earth get bombarded by things occasionally, and they send up huge amounts of ejecta. And there actually have been some people who have raised the possibility that life might have emerged first on Mars. It got hit by something large, and it sent that life to Earth. And that's where life on Earth came from. The planets are not just isolated bodies. They do exchange matter, and there are forms of life like tardigrades and things that are able to withstand space. And so, just like there is on our own planet, there's this constant interaction of everything going on, and that's true with larger things in space. And so, it's certainly possible that if we find life elsewhere here in our own solar system, particularly if it's in the inner planets, it might well be that there was some connection there. Now, if we find it in the ocean of Europa, that seems pretty unlikely that there's any connection there. That would be much more likely that it emerged twice in the same solar system independently. And if that happened, it would suggest that there's a really good possibility that there's life all over the place, because it would be pretty strange for it to emerge, separately in the same solar system. Unless it was a fairly common occurrence. So again, we don't have any evidence of anything yet, really. But there's some, tantalizing things that raise the possibility that there are some other parts of our solar system where life is at least possible.
And again, I'm going to interject my own comment there to that professor, is that we are focused on life as we know it, a carbon-based life form, but may not be the only thing out there. And would we, if we certainly could find another life system that would certainly designate more life. We don't know.
Well, we don't even really have a very good definition of life on our own planet. I mean, is COVID alive or not? Viruses inhabit a kind of strange in between space between, living and not living. And so there have been changes in the definition of what life is, and there are some different ideas about what life is. And so if you're interested, I would recommend a book called The Coevolution by a guy named Edward Lee, I think. And it's a fascinating book in which he basically argues that our machines are already alive. And he makes a very, very interesting case. It's an excellent book.
Okay, had lots of kudos and thank yous for your presentation. There is one comment I hear from Frank Wynn, who noted that you didn't mention the movie classic Galaxy Quest, where an alien life interprets our Star Trek-like broadcast of entertainment as historical records, and they come to Earth requesting our help. So, who who knows what effect we're having.
Yeah, and Sigourney Weaver might be with them. Who knows? But that's a great movie, and it does. I mean, how would an alien differentiate what our fiction is from what our fact is? They might have a very hard time with that. We would probably have a hard time with it if we encountered it from, something came to us. So it actually, I've always thought that's a pretty interesting idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, again, I don't see any more questions in the chat or anybody with their hands raised. Does anybody else have anything you'd like to ask Professor Traphagan? I don't see anybody else or hear any. So I want to thank you very much for.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
One more. Who's there?
Brian.
Wolfgang. It's Wolfgang.
Yes,
Hello?
Wolf.
There's Wolf. Go ahead, talk.
Okay. I found it very interesting that a Jesuit who's also an astronomer brings up this idea, or maybe he didn't, it didn't come from him, but he certainly is presenting the idea that should this alien, whatever they are, be baptized.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine the I don't know, the feeling of supremacy that this religious person has, feeling that any other religion wouldn't have any effect. It's only that Christianity would be the main religion of the earth and is the only one that's important. And therefore, that question is the only one that should be raised.
Or that religion is better than whatever religion might have been going on in that other world.
Yeah. And also then, doesn't it mean that all, I don't know, Buddhists and Hindus, and shouldn't they all be baptized as well? I mean,
Well,
the arrogance of it just really strikes me.
yeah, I mean that's been certainly the modus operandi of Christianity for a long time. Yeah. I will say though that to some extent in his defense, he did raise the question in part to point out the problem of colonialism and imperialism, and that this would arise if we were to take that mindset there. So he was, I mean, I've talked to him about it, and I think he would be willing to baptize ET, but he wouldn't do it if ET didn't want it. But it was kind of one of these things that they were trying to get into this question about, how does religion intersect with imperialism? And so in that sense, I think he was well-meaning in the way that he was proposing the idea, but it raised it was just a very strange thought when he raised it, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you. Great.
Yeah.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Again, I go Wolf's words. Great presentation. We appreciate your time today. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording and say thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for having me. I very much enjoyed it.
Great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.